seats. My name is Judy Guerin, and I direct NCSF Consent Count Project, which seeks to decriminalize consensual BDSM. This was a project that started in 2006 at the Political Creating Change Conference, and a group of leather and LGBTQ leaders got together and decided that the most important priority for the BDSM leather fetish communities was to decriminalize consensual BDSM. It started for 2 years as a community-wide project, and CSF served on the steering committee of that project, along with a number of other groups. And we started by surveying, doing plenaries, town halls, things like that all around the country. Two things became readily apparent to us. One is that there was a vast difference in what people interpreted consent within the BDSM community to be. And so we started by doing extensive surveying and coming up with statements about what consent meant. It took us from the initiation of the project, I think 6 years, to come up with a statement that the majority of the community could agree to. I am not going to really talk a lot about that project and what we're doing with that project, but strategically developing a consent statement and changing the DSM criteria so that we are no longer mentally ill were critically important to this project. Where we are now with the project is we're working with the American Law Institute, which develops the Model Penal Code, which most states use when they change their laws to look at as an example. They're in the process of revising their sexual assault laws and also dealing with campus procedures. And we have been working with them for about 1.5 years on sexual assault, and we think made a lot of progress in giving them input and feedback on not just what they should include about BDSM, but the whole topic of consent in general. I'm going to let Dick Cunningham talk a little bit about that when we go through the different areas that we're speaking about today. I'm not going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to let them talk a little bit about themselves and what they've done with the topic of consent, and then we'll ask each of them questions, and they will answer. Why don't we start with you, Robert?
Okay. Hi, my name is Robin Friedman, and I'm a criminal defense attorney here in the Seattle area. I practice mainly up north. My relationship with consent is on defending people who are charged with various crimes. I do a lot of work with people in the alternative sexuality communities, so I get a lot of the consensual relationships where the partners break up and all of a sudden it becomes assault. And so that's where I come in. It's really interesting. I was looking through the WIPICs, which is our pattern jury instructions, and I found a really fun little thing. Because I've been saying this for years, because people ask about, how many people have heard the SM is assault and you cannot consent to assault, so SM is a crime. You've all heard that, right? Okay, I've been saying for years, I don't assault anybody because I never have the intention of hurting anybody. If I did have the intention of hurting anybody, I wouldn't have spent so many years learning about body mechanics and biology and physiology and learning how to use the tools that I use. But I'm looking through the WIPICs, and it says here under the defenses, an act is not an assault if it is done with the consent of the person alleged to be assaulted. I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting that they have that in there. Now, of course, it goes a lot to the athletics and sports, but the fact that it's there, and we don't have a whole lot of recent case law about you can't consent to assault. That's multi-jurisdictional. Most of it's state-specific. So it's a good thing that you'll be able to use it. But anyway, that's kind of where I come into the picture. I've been working with NCSF since about 2000. I was introduced to them in 1999 when they were here for Living in Leather. And for a while I directed what was then the Legal Education Outreach Program, and now it's the Education Outreach Program, and all inclusive, so that's where I come in.
I'm Rudy Serra. I'm a former judge in the city of Detroit. I was the first openly gay person to be a judge in Michigan, as well as the first openly gay member of my Board of Education and County Commission. I currently serve on the Model Criminal Jury Instructions Committee for the state Supreme Court in Michigan, and so I brought a little bit of material about jury instructions myself. I think I first met Judy at that Creating Change conference that she mentioned, and I've been involved in some other leadership conference work, and have been a speaker with NCSF before.
I'm Reedy Mukopade. I'm the coordinating attorney at the Sexual Violence Legal Services. It's a program of the local YWCA, and our focus is providing holistic legal needs to survivors of sexual assault, sexual abuse, which basically means we take the person, not the case. So you come to us, you tell us that you've been sexually assaulted, and we will try to represent you or provide you support in all the legal needs, your housing, employment, Title IX, education, immigration, getting a protection order. And in my capacity as an attorney, I've represented survivors in particularly vulnerable communities within the immigrant population, individuals with disabilities, the sex worker population, and within the kink community. This is my first NCSF panel, so I really appreciate being here.
I'm Dick Cunningham. I practice law with 500 of my closest friends in one of the big law firms headquartered in Washington, D.C., where I do in my vanilla life primarily international trade law. But I have a background of, 45 years of doing lots of social advocacy work and lots of law on social issues, ranging from the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War stuff, to the case that got women the right to go to the military academies, to various, more recently, activities in the sexual freedom area. I was asked, and largely my wife Judy and I have done lots of work with NCSF and other BDSM-focused and sexual freedom-focused organizations for 20 years now, to be counsel to the Consent Counts Project. And I might take just 1 second to sort of relate that to what we've been talking about, what you've been hearing. One of the messages that I hope you've received in all of the discussions about consent today is that the issue of consent isn't something that you look at and say, well, let's see what's logical here and what really works and all of that. It's all bound up in prejudices, it's all bound up in preconceptions, it's all bound up in power relationships, it's all bound up in things that affect the way people react to other people, but also affect the way judges, juries, and prosecutors react to an issue like consent and BDSM. And when they asked me we're going to decriminalize BDSM, we're your client, that's your job. I took a look at it and said, well, it's a piece of cake. Supreme Court has said in Lawrence v. Texas that private consensual sexual practices can't be criminalized unless there's a valid societal reason to do so, and moral disapproval is not such a valid societal reason, and you all have a right of privacy to do things like that. I said, that's great. So then I looked at the Model Penal Code, and the Model Penal Code says assault, which is the prosecution most frequently brought against BDSM, it has as a defense the issue of consent, unless there is serious injury caused by the assault. And serious injury is defined as loss of life, threat of loss of life, loss of limbs, loss of bodily function, serious stuff. So I said, piece of cake. Then I started looking at the decisions. There's never been a single state court decision that has ever allowed consent as a defense in an assault prosecution arising out of BDSM. And they deal with things like serious injury by saying, there was serious injury here. They use nipple clamps. Serious injury. They dropped hot wax on that poor person. Serious injury. And since then, we have been working with state legislatures. We've been working with the American Law Institute. We've been handling cases. And we've been getting our own house in order in terms of what we can tell people in those constituencies, the JLI, the legislatures, prosecutors, police, about the BDSM community, that it is a community which makes almost a fetish, terrible choice of words, but anyway, a fetish out of having affirmative consent. This is a yes means yes community. We have safe words. We pre-negotiate scenes. We have dungeon monitors, up, down, and sideways. It's affirmative consent. So this should be a classic of a case where we can sell this as consent here really, really should prevent criminal prosecution unless something really serious is done in the way of injury. And we're getting there. And we can talk a little bit more about how we're getting there as we go on.
Okay, let me start by asking you some questions. How have courts and legislatures dealt with consent in criminal law concepts, such as rape, sodomy, physical assault, sexual assault, trafficking, battery, and domestic violence? Rudy?
I think that it's important to preface the discussion by understanding the foundational importance of consent. Way back, the founding document of our country, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those rights are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are created among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Consent is foundational. When you think about consent in a legal context, it comes up first and foremost in the medical area. Competent adults have a right to decline life-saving medical care. If you don't believe in blood transfusions and the doctor says, I need to give you a transfusion or you're going to die, the law says you have a right to decline, and the doctor cannot be prosecuted. Now, different states, different jurisdictions have dealt with these issues in very different ways. You just heard NCSF, their goal is to decriminalize consensual BDSM. In the state where I come from, Lawrence versus Texas, that's quoted by Brother Counsel, Mr. Cunningham down there, doesn't apply in Michigan and 18 other states. 2 men are in prison or have gone to prison in Michigan since Lawrence versus Texas under the abominable and detestable crime against nature statute. There is still a gross indecency law that makes you vulnerable to a felony if you have oral sex in private, meaning we now have the right to get married, but if you have oral sex with your partner in the privacy of your home, unpaid, you can be charged with a crime. Is that right? No. Is it just and constitutional? No. Will it stand? No. Because eventually someone will have the resources to appeal and challenge it, and those statutes will be struck down. Or better yet, some legislator will grow a vagina, which tends to be more resilient than balls. And they will introduce legislation to repeal laws that we know are unconstitutional. But that's part of what we face when we deal with consent. It's foundational in our society, and yet our society is in a hysteria about 2 things, sex and drugs. I can't overemphasize what you heard earlier. Every case I'm involved with, every criminal case, not just this time, has involved drugs or alcohol. That's what's getting people, the drugs and the alcohol. And then one last point in terms of how jurisdictions respond to this. I see a couple of you here. Got these things in your ears. Are there holes there? Well, those doctors went to jail, right? That's permanent bodily disfigurement. Well, didn't they? I mean, never mind. I had a guy once who actually had that through another part of his body. And I thought, wow, that's permanent bodily disfigurement. But the doctors don't go to jail. Why? Consent.
Well, consent is also societal. It has to do with, does it affront the society?
So that's a big part of it as well. So,
Sex and drugs.
sex and drugs. And I mean, look at what we're looking at right now. What's happened in the last couple of weeks. It's like, it's insane out there. But when I've dealt with criminal cases, I've done several assault cases in the Pentagon. I actually had a case down in Pierce County, which is extremely conservative. And I got a judge down there to use the word play in context of what my clients were doing. And, yeah, he said, no, you were obviously playing. There was, consent was involved. It wasn't an assault. You were obviously partners, and, and I was able to get dismissed against my client. And that I was able to do that in Pierce County was kind of astounding, number one, because restraining orders in Pierce County are kind of like the ham sandwich indictments. They'll pass them out, no thought. I've done about 7 restraining orders now down in Pierce County, and I've only lost 1. So I've defended against all the others in common law. But yeah, that's where I tend to see a lot of the consent issues. Right now, prosecutors, because I've talked to a lot of prosecutors and I've talked to a lot of judges, and fortunately, it's changed a lot since I first started practicing, because it has become a lot more visible since I first started practicing. Same-sex marriage now occurs. I don't have to do legal documents to create legal relationships, where I don't have to do those anymore. You can actually get them yourself. But they understand that now. There's movies and everything else. I mean, even though the movies were crap, but at least so they have a better understanding of it. Jury. That was, I did a case in front of a jury. The jury's like, this is nonsense. Why does it have to go this far? It's obvious what happened here. This wasn't a crime. These were 2 adults that were, and it's obvious, So I think we're reaching it's about money is what it's about. Because if we can get these cases in front of the jury and your attorney knows enough about FM, they can educate the jury and get the case taken care of. But it costs a lot of money to take it all the way to trial. So a lot of clients will just say, well, they're offering, a deal where I can walk away with this and I can get a gross misdemeanor, and in 5 years I can go out and see about getting it expunged from my record. And I try to explain to them that even though you're getting it expunged from your record, third parties have all that information. So anybody who does a criminal check on you, yeah, if they do it through the state court, they're not going to find anything. But if they do it through any of those agencies that purchase that information, it's all going to come up. So paying the extra money to have your record expunged, might as well just put on the application, yes, I got caught, but it got dismissed, or I did what I was supposed to do. But again, it costs anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 to get this in front of a jury, and a lot of people don't have that much money to get a case dismissed. That's why we don't have a lot of these cases. We don't have a lot of case law about SM specifically, and that's a problem. Most of the case law, other than like Dementia and a couple other cases, are back in the 80s. A lot of my clients weren't even born when this stuff happened. So again, if you get in front of a jury, it's finding that one case that we're going to be able to get case law on, and I think that will take care of a lot of this stuff. But again, it's going to cost money.
On the flip side of that, in Washington, in the criminal context, consent is defined as actual words or conduct, indicating that agreement was given freely. And on the victim side, if you are a part of the teen community, if you do try to report an assault, if you do try to report non-consensual sexual conduct, even though we do have a definition of consent in the criminal context, usually you're dealing with law enforcement that's saying, well, you put yourself in this situation, or you're dealing with prosecutors who will say, I understand you may have said no, but you didn't say no enough times, or you didn't, make it clear enough. And so it's on both sides of the spectrum, it's a really complicated reality on how judges and prosecutors and law enforcement are actually looking at the rules and, as Dick said, bringing in their own implicit biases and how they're deciding consent should be applied. And instead of, I always say, listen to the victims. These are cases that are not easy to come forward with. These are very private, intimate acts that most of us do not speak about publicly. If a victim is coming forward and saying that, you know, I have been sexually assaulted, that should carry a lot of weight. Unfortunately, we're in a legal system where our victims are often treated like perpetrators. That you know, makes the consent conversation much more complicated, and the legal system is definitely still quite backwards and aggressive in how they decide to.
I'd just like to add one footnote to that. She's absolutely right. She's absolutely right about the fact that it's the prejudices of the prosecutors and judges that override what the law is in many cases, in many contexts of consent. Tide is on our side, not just in Orange, Texas, and not just in the Moralistic Code. I'm a little older than some of you here. I went to law school back in the 60s. When you took a criminal law course in the 60s, usually it was taught by lecturers older, so you spent 40% of the course on rape cases, because the rape cases were what he thought were just hysterical. And the law was beastly. Not only was every aspect of a woman's past absolutely admissible, but consent obtained by fraud was not consent. There was rules that fraud vitiates consent, and so you had the dentist cases, where the woman went to the dentist and he said, "You've got a terrible, terrible problem with your teeth, but there's a natural solution to it, which I can apply to you right here in the dentist chair." And pretty soon she was walking out of there having been raped, but her consent had been obtained by fraud, so there was still consent. And so the law is lurching forward, both on the rape and sexual assault side from the victim standpoint, and on the BDSM standpoint, although lurching forward in somewhat different ways. But we still have to either make the law clear enough or change the attitudes of people clearly enough, so that you do not have the phenomenon we have, which is that there are people in charge of the justice system who think this is bad stuff. They think women are harlots out there seducing men. They think that BDSM people are doing stuff that's immoral, and they'll sort of find a way to get around the law. And that's what we're dealing with. And as I say, we'll talk much more. We're making progress.
Second question. How did the legal approaches to these issues vary among communities? College students, BDSM, sex workers?
We'll start with college students.
I mean, I can tell you from our perspective, the legal approach, at least regardless of if you're a college student or a sex worker or a member of the BDSM community, in my work has always been similar, which is from a victim standpoint, from a survivor standpoint, the legal approach is always the the first thing that my clients are dealing with is their own internal shaming, the cultural shaming that they know that they're going to face. And so a lot of the time, the legal approach is often the most intimidating approach, the approach that is going to further traumatize them, further victimize them. And one thing I always remind the judges, remind the prosecutors and law enforcement that we end up in opposing counsel when we end up working with them is most of my clients are not seeking revenge. They are seeking remorse. They're seeking a guarantee that the person that hurt them will not be hurting others in a similar fashion. So I think, at least within the communities I work in, it's not necessarily a legal approach as much as emotional approach. And how do I protect myself? How do I be believed? And who is going to believe me?
Well, one of the things that question brings to mind, though, is the complexity of the issue of consent, which varies greatly with the context.
greatly with the type of situation you're in. Kids in college are exploring, they're feeling their way along. Women are not sophisticated in ways of dealing with advances by men. Men have hormones rushing through them and are trying to assert their masculine egos and do some terrible things. The consent that a woman understands is appropriate, or that a man understands is appropriate, is an evolving thing for them in colleges. One of my favorite quotes that I like to use in all of this is from the great Bob Seger rock and roll song called Night Moves, which is about two kids making love in the backseat of a car. He describes it as working on mysteries without any clues. And there's a lot of that in that you have to sort your way through in defining what consent works in college campuses. On the other hand, in the BDSM context, there are varieties of consent situations and consent relationships. One of the things we paid a great deal of attention to in the consent counts exercise has been working with and trying to find a way to reach accommodation with the master-slave community. There's a master-slave community, a master-slave relationship, in a sense, establishes sort of an umbrella consent that's supposed to last for the relationship. The slave consents to what the master wants the slave to do, and that may or may not be well-defined and all of that. And there have been some in the master-slave community that say it's not the question of what consent is given at the time of the act, it's what's the consent in the relationship. Well, as one of my Texas clients says, in the law, that dog won't hunt. In the law, and the law is right on this point, absolutely right. Consent can be withdrawn and should be withdrawn at any time, right up to the point where the penis is getting that far from the orifice, and you say, wait a minute, no, I've changed my mind. But we've had to work out it. We've done it. We've worked out a working relationship with the master-slave community so that we can move forward in this way. The complexities of consent, the complexities of relationships, the complexities of events are multitudinous, and they really are, the law, people have trouble grappling with it, and the law has trouble grappling with it.
Well, Mr. Cunningham accurately points out that the complexity is a problem long before dealing with legal issues. My field of study was communication studies, and one of the most elementary principles in communication studies is that meanings are in people, not in words. In other words, we decide to call this blue and we call this red, then I'm wearing a red suit. It's our agreement on the meaning of the words, and not every person means the same thing with the word. So consent is more than just superficial yes or no. Consent can go beyond that and mean really determining what that other person is trying to convey to me. What message are they transmitting to me, and am I getting it? And in communication studies, probably the most relevant thing relative to consent is the concept of feedback. Because meanings are in people and not in words, we haven't communicated unless I give you feedback that shows I understood what you were trying to tell me. The law really doesn't approach it in that kind of a sophisticated way at all. In the law, she said no, that's it, or vice versa.
And in addition to the master-slave issue, you also have the groups that practice the consensual, non-consensual.
That's right, yeah.
And that is, there's no way you're going to be able to convey that to your typical jury in a way that they're going to understand it.
Right. That underlines one other thing about this, and that is when you're dealing with this particular situation, because of that sort of problem, and because the courts are very likely to, and the prosecutors are very likely to impose a moralistic overview that's going to make the case very difficult. The name of the game, first and foremost, is stop the prosecution before it goes forward to bring this case to trial. Convinced the judge, maybe in big cases, NCSM has brought political pressure on the judge, on the prosecutor. There's a woman by the name of Linda Fairstein who writes mystery novels now and used to be head of the sex crimes unit prosecuting in New York. That's what the Law and Order SUV series is based upon. And she and Judy had a huge direct battle over her desire to prosecute a BDSM case, even though clearly consensual, the chief thought was over the top. The final score was Guerin 1, Fairstein 0. I can find a Fairstein novel for you that has a character in it that is very clearly the Judy Guerin character that does not get painted in a good light. But that is very often the name of the game. And in some of these cases are high-profile cases. Like the Tamalboro case in Massachusetts, where the police raided a BDSM party being held across the street from the police department, which was an interesting choice of venue. A woman was prosecuted for assault, criminal assault with a deadly weapon. She went a wooden spoon, which is why they called it Tamalboro. It took, how many years?
A year and a half.
A year and a half.
$70,000.
$70,000 in legal fees and a lot of political pressure, and finally we got the case dropped. Not going to court and acquitted, but dropped. And in many of these cases, that's the best way, maybe the only way to handle it.
I just want to make two comments. One is that one of the issues we have in not having the case law is that NCSF has been quite successful in getting these cases dropped at the lower level. However, the high-profile attorney in Attleboro, Massachusetts, had a career break of this particular case immediately. And I also just want to say that one of the differences in how these things are treated, or with BDSM as an example, BDSM is prosecuted as assault. And so the victim is much less likely to come forward because there is no anonymity. It's one of the reasons we're trying to...
No rape shield law that protects your identity.
So that's one of the reasons we're trying to get it moved into the sexual assault category, so they have that anonymity. And then there are people who are moralistic, who just think it's wrong and you shouldn't be doing it. Sex workers have an even bigger problem with that. They get, well, what do you expect? You're a sex worker.
That question is about how different communities respond, and earlier we were talking about rape culture. Since we're on the Pacific Coast, some of you may not be aware of how my particular community has reacted to some of the very extreme cases of non-consent. We found about 11,000 rape kits in a warehouse that had been sitting there for a decade and a half or so. And now people are being convicted of rapes that happened 15 years ago. Some of them are dead. Some of them are already serving life in prison for other crimes. But that's how one community has responded. What do you think if you're in Detroit and you get raped? How excited are you going to be about reporting it? How cooperative do you want to be about getting your rape kit? By the way, Republican rape kits, they contain handcuffs, GBH, blindfolds. Regular rape kits contain swabs, slides.
No, it wasn't a question, it was a statement as a rape victim from the state of Michigan. 0.
Okay, that's good. Jeff, there's a question back here.
Yes.
The big question I have is, we're seeing this in our own community up in Vancouver Island once in a while, where if there is a rape or an assault that occurs, and within the BDSM community, there are some individuals, victims, that are uncomfortable going to the police, or even if they have gone to the police, even if they have had a rape kit done, everything has all been done. Now it's time for the prosecution, and time after time I've seen where people have decided not to prosecute for the simple reason that now their name is going to be in the paper. There's going to be a discussion about it. There seems to be absolutely no protection of the victim's rights when it comes to possible prosecution. Is there any way that can be actually completely silence the existence of the case going on?
That's why we're trying to get this moved into sexual assault for prosecution.
Okay.
With it being prosecuted as a sexual assault case, there are supposed to be some protections for the victim. For example, the media is not supposed to be releasing a victim's name.
Okay.
That is something that is supposed to be agreed, like the AP community has agreed to that, yet every once in a while that information does get out there. When police reports leak, when public disclosure, through public disclosure, a victim's information is supposed to be redacted. Private information is supposed to be redacted. One thing, for example, we do is if we are lucky enough to get prosecution to agree to file charges, we stay on the case to protect the victim's privacy rights. So our position is just because you are reporting a rape, that does not mean your life is open book. That means the only focus that law enforcement and prosecution should have is on the rape itself. It's not about your sexual history or sexual past. It's not about whether or not you've gotten mental health counseling before. The focus should be on the sexual assault. Unfortunately, a lot of prosecutors get it. A lot of prosecutors don't get it. Prosecution, sometimes they're concerned, and rightly so. Robin obviously will say it's really important to consider the due process rights of the defendant, but prosecution and making sure everything is handed over to defense, and defense has all the evidence that the state has access to. A lot of times prosecution will overreach and get private information from the victim that they never should have been asking for. And a lot of that gets released, unfortunately, prematurely. But the laws are there to protect survivors who are reporting, at least in Washington. The reality of how that's applied, it really varies county to county. One thing that we often do when we're working with somebody from the BDSM community or any community and trying to talk to prosecution about filing charges or getting law enforcement to take the case very seriously is we will try to find other instances or other victims. A lot of times these cases are not investigated as well as they should be, and often where there's been a reporting of a sexual assault, if it's to the point where somebody is coming forward because it was that much of a violent act that they feel like we can't hold this back in, I can guarantee you that assailant probably has had previous victims in their past that they've groomed and that they've over time become more and more violent or more obvious in their assault. And so a lot of times it's a huge burden to put on a survivor, but one thing when we get hotline calls, I will tell people, I bet you were not the first person. You were the first person probably brave enough to come forward and say something publicly. So one thing I recommend you do is start asking, have you heard anything similar about this person? I use the word creepy. I always think that's like the coded language. Most of us are very polite, and we don't want to say somebody is a rapist or somebody is a terrible person. Usually the language you'll hear is, they make me uncomfortable, I don't want to be around them, they're really creepy. So one thing I will tell callers or people reaching out to us, ask, have you heard anything through the grapevine? Because I bet you will be able to find another survivor, somebody else. And law enforcement, they need to know about other victims. And a lot of times that might be enough to change a prosecutor's mind or a detective's mind and hopefully investigating that case properly and pushing forward.
I also just want to talk about that NCSF does have an incident response line, and we do a lot of work with victims in helping them evaluate the situation. We also do a lot of work with prosecutors.
I was also going to say, it's one thing to come forward. Where people are starting to come forward is not to the prosecutor.
Yes.
They're coming forward on FetLife and on Facebook.
Yes.
And once you start getting in that arena, then the credibility starts going downhill.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden you've got
30 people say, oh, me too, and you don't,
Unfortunately, there's this idea that
that's a
there's
problem.
only one right way to, report and get prosecuted, and that's also where the law needs to change, the practice needs to change, where judges need to understand the neurobiology of trauma, and prosecution and law enforcement, they need to understand how individuals react to trauma and why, you're not going to report a sexual assault within 24 hours and get a rape kit done within 72 hours and, be available every single time law enforcement wants to talk to you, because obviously you are going to go through your own process of understanding what happened to you, something that is not normal, that none of us should experience, that our brains are not meant to be able to naturally reason through. So there are resources out there, and it's not easy always accessing them, but there are supposed to be laws in place that protect the victim's rights here in Washington.
Despite those laws, back home in Michigan, I'm now dealing with a rape case involving a bail victim. For the first time in my career, the police gave an unredacted report to the perpetrator of the rape so that he would get the confidential shelter information where my client was staying and my client's phone. So those laws are there. They are routinely violated because of bigotry and prejudice. And that's the reason why it's so important that you're here. Because a lawyer can go in and do certain things, a social worker does other things, a counselor does other things, and there's only so much we can do. And that's why, well, one of the things I hope comes out of these sessions is more and more of you deciding, yeah, it's time to go to law school. Hearing about the law, but let me tell you, in this world, it's not benefiting people in our communities the way it was intended.
So let me move on to the next question.
I was going to go to that next question.
Do we have a question?
I think my question might be changed in this context, so I'll just wait.
Okay.
But I just quickly want to
back there. Please.
I was just going to quickly say, I actually don't encourage everybody to go to law school, since that's taking on a lot of debt. But there are a lot of ways to really challenge the law, and also, prosecutors, judges in a lot of jurisdictions, they're elected and they're appointed through the legislative process, and it's really, really important that we all be very involved in our local politics and know who to hold accountable and who not to hold accountable.
Read what the judges, a lot of people just go, oh, A, B, C.
Yeah.
Actually figure out, learn who the judges are. Whenever it's like election time, that's when I start getting all the emails from my friends saying, who should I be voting for on this one? I can tell you who I would vote for, but you might have different specs than I do, so.
But homework
actually read
is
up on the
hard.
judges.
But homework is hard.
I know.
So, I do understand protecting victims and wanting to report sexual assault. My concern there would be is, yes, there are some cases of false accusations, and since this also bridges into the BDSM community, what then would happen, say, if I was doing a team topping and then they go back, say there was a violation, would then that put me under the umbrella of possibly ending up with becoming a sex offender?
Yes.
So would it not be better to try to open that umbrella?
Let me come to that for a second, because that gets to what we're trying to do with the American Law Institute. And the American Law Institute is revising the criminal assault, the sexual assault law, getting a whole new set of sexual assault laws, so that things would be in sexual assaults as opposed to criminal assault. They're dividing sexual assault into two categories. One is sexual assault, which requires penetration. Some of that in BDSM, most BDSM is not penetration. And then there's a series of degrees of sexual contact, criminal sexual contact, non-consensual sexual contact. And except for the very highest plateau of those would be subject to the rape shield law, the defense of the privacy of the complainant and all of that, but wouldn't get you on the sex offender list. Would there be some cases that would be, you become a sex offender now where you wouldn't be on a criminal assault case? Maybe. I don't know how many, but you'd be charged with a much lesser offense under the worst of circumstances, a much lesser criminal prison time exposure, and most of it would be stuff where we would have clearly to achieve the big thing we want to achieve as the BDSM, and that is we want the law to look at BDSM as something different than I'm going to assault you, I'm going to do violence to you, and instead as something that you and I are going to do something for mutual pleasure, consensually, and if something happens, maybe something goes wrong, unless it violates consent or causes truly serious injury, it's okay. And we're moving toward that. We're not entirely there with the ALI, but it's a big steps toward that with them.
Yes.
So I heard Riddy say get involved in local politics, especially the election of judges. And I heard Robin say that her friends often contact her when it comes near election times. And I heard someone else say, gee, that's really hard work. So my thought is maybe the NCSF could make endorsement lists kind of like newspapers do, or provide a forum where people could make comments locally in their communities, and its ordinance list could be positive as well as negative towards various judges.
Or here in the state of Washington, we already have something similar to that, the Washington State Bar Association. There's a similar thing where they do rate the judges on what they do and the kind of cases that they try and how they come down on certain decisions.
But
so that might be a nice starting point.
Might be a start, but specifically towards consent and sexual community might be nice to have that.
NCSF legally cannot endorse
it's not
it. We are not that type of
Provide a forum where people can discuss it.
We can develop questions that you can ask candidates and have them evaluate it on that basis. We currently don't have the resources.
You have to realize all federal judges are appointed for life. So you're always dealing, when you're dealing with elections, with state judges. So if you have a statewide LGBTQ organization, they may already do for the state judges what you're looking for.
For example, in King County, they have a Court Watch program. Here in Seattle, they have a Court Watch program where they every week go in and they track how judges decide both criminal sexual assault cases, rape cases, and civil sexual assault cases where the victims themselves, they're going in and asking for a protection order. King County is a larger jurisdiction and it's possible to find more volunteers to do stuff like that. But those are also some options at the local level for judges to know that the public is actually in there watching them and holding them accountable. That itself also has weight. So it's that sort of accountability. If you have the time, if you know people, a Court Watch program is also a way of tracking and kind of collecting that information.
And then this can work. There was a judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, actually was a high school classmate of mine, but he developed a practice of really denigrating the women who were in his courtroom, making sort of snide remarks about them, asking questions about, well, what were you wearing and things like that. And an uproar was created, and he's no longer a judge. It does work.
So we're getting a little short on time. I'm going to come back to the constitutional issues if we have time. But let's talk about what are the practical legal issues. What type of consent is sufficient? When must consent be given and when it can be withdrawn? Is it best to confirm consent during sexual interaction? How should consent be monitored in group events? The special problems of consensual non-consent, which we touched on. What about heavy or extreme sex play? Are these acts to which consent cannot be given? What about consent of non-involved parties? Example, public things. Who wants to start with that?
Well, I can start a little bit on that. This is one of the things that we talked about in terms of great varieties of consent. The law is very clear that consent can be withdrawn at any time. The law is unclear as to in a particular factual case as to what it was that was consented to. If it's rape, it's pretty black and white. Not always, but pretty black and white. BDSM, I remember Susan saying, how am I going to convince an arresting officer that I was perfectly happy to be caned on my bottom, but as I crawled away, I never gave consent to being caned on the back of my legs and the bottoms of my feet. And so the more precise one can be, the more you can clearly withdraw consent as to something being done in the act. And that sometimes isn't easy because you may be in bottom space and you may not be kind of using intellectual analysis at that time. But it's also important, if you can, to have some sort of validation or witnesses to consent that you've given and to the conduct of the act, such that you can have people testify as to what you consented to and what was in fact done.
That would get a little tricky though, because you don't necessarily know what they might have talked about prior to there. So you might know what they were talking about when you're videoing and seeing in front of you.
Right.
But when you mentioned something that we talk about when you can and cannot consent,
Yep.
bottom space. That is not a time where you ask anybody. There's no consent there because you don't have the mental capacity.
Thank you.
So you can't kind of go, ask as you go along. And I've seen a lot of people doing that. It's like, well, they didn't say no. That doesn't mean they said yes. So the bottom space, there's no consent there at all. It's hard because consent can be done through words or affirmative action. Either one of them can be consent. But if you're doing it in a public space, the only way that the people around you will know that it is not consented to is if they use the public safe word. They say red, because again, you don't know the relationship, you don't know what consent is for them. So it makes it's really tricky. Consent is a tricky concept altogether, because it's amorphous, it comes, it goes. One day this is perfectly fine, the next day absolutely not. So yeah, affirmative yes, no is the best way to go.
And bear in mind, in addition to what was called bottom space, if a person is impaired with drugs or alcohol, or because of a mental illness or disability, they are not competent to give consent. It's very difficult and troubling because sometimes the person to whom they're giving consent may not be aware of it. And I think that it's important for us to bear in mind as well that sometimes the perpetrator who is drunk or using drugs may not be acting out of evil or malice, but may also be an addict, may be sick, may be mentally ill. So in the BDSM community, just like every other community, we have to bear in mind that sometimes we're dealing with people that aren't competent.
But I actually have it sitting right here on the top of my face. Part of the jury instruction, is up in rape in the second degree. Or indecent liberty, it is a defense to a charge of rape in the second or indecent liberty that at the time of the act, the defendant reasonably believed that the named person was not mentally defective or mentally incapacitated or physically helpless. At that point, though, the defendant has the burden of proving this defense by a preponderance of evidence, not by reasonable doubt. Preponderance is more likely than not they had a reasonable belief that this was so. But it's kind of interesting that way because, some people do not present as that they have an issue. They present perfectly fine.
And bear in mind, despite this instruction, if you reasonably believe that your partner is an adult and they're actually a minor, your reasonable belief does no good at all.
That's statutory.
When it comes to age, it's strict liability.
Let me introduce another really complex issue. We talked about people who don't have the mental capability, people who are mentally challenged, can't give consent. The law is clear on that. Everybody sitting around here is nodding their head and saying, well, yeah, that's right. Suppose you're an advocate for mentally challenged people. That's right. Isn't that saying to mentally challenged people you can't have a sex life?
Exactly.
We dealt with that.
Exactly the same.
And we dealt with that very specifically in Michigan in terms of the people in the special education field, moving the paradigm so that it no longer is Johnny and Mary, you're not allowed to have sex. Now the paradigm is we teach you when it's appropriate, we teach you about birth control, and we teach you about consent. But, you know, it's interesting because we're dealing now with a population of folks that are in facilities like group homes, and a very tricky borderline issue. If you're in a group home, you're recognized as developmentally disabled. Is there a guardian conservator? You know, all of those things.
It's also really important to recognize that just because you have a disability, it doesn't mean that you're not a sexual being. And for so long, this is a community that's been treated as not having any sexual needs, and not only on the victim side, but on the predator side too. This is something I would see as a public defender, which is individual with disabilities then being treated as predators because nobody ever treated them like a sexual being, and you have a 45-year-old man who mentally identifies as a 7-year-old child and is then sexually assaulting a 7-year-old child because nobody talks about sexual assault. So, no, it's definitely a very complicated conversation.
I also want to add to that same subject also is the issue of consent of people that are aging, that have Alzheimer's, dementia, that are living in assisted living facilities, and families that will separate people. And the reality is that our aging population is having more sex than ever. And
the growing.
I'd like to say I can justify that myself.
And it's an issue about consent is a big issue when it comes to assisted living facilities and stuff. I've been doing a bunch of work around that recently, and it's something that is definitely something for us to be aware of.
So I have a question about informed competent consent. And it used to be, I don't know, at least 5 years ago around here that we said no means no. And then it got changed to yes means yes. And to me, these are incomplete. To me, it should be no means no, and only yes means yes. And the reason I say this is if you don't have that word only, then you get a default yes. If a person is unable to say no for the various reasons that were mentioned, being high, drugs, being in subspace, and they can't say yes, then they can't say no, then someone could take this as a yes. So I came in here today, I was going to bring up this point, and I thought about having a FetLife discussion for about the last 2 years about this, adding the phrase, no means no and only yes means yes. Now, one thing that was kind of a wrench thrown into the works today was I heard about giving consent by words and actions. And so if we're to say only yes means yes, that's kind of saying that you have to say yes with words, but you can also say with actions. And to me, this brings up a whole gray area of what is an action saying yes? What if you don't do an action and you're not saying no? You know, you have the default yes again because the person hasn't been able to say no. So I guess I have 2 points here I want to be addressed. One is the no means no and only yes means yes. How necessary is that word only? And two, this giving consent by action versus words.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Say you've been in a relationship with a woman for 20 years, a BDSM relationship with a woman for 20 years, and you know each other inside out, upside down, you know your preferences and all of that. Only yes means yes is required?
Well, I would bring up kind of like the master-slave is general consent versus specific consent, that you would have general consent.
No context. I don't understand it in the yes means yes context.
Well, that's kind of why I had second thoughts. I mean, the problem I have with no means no is if you can't say no, then you go, oh, then they must mean yes, which isn't necessarily logically valid, but people do it.
Well, there's the habit in the universities, it's happening mostly in the Asian universities. When I first started happening about the yes, only yes means yes, That was where you get into that ridiculous list of, you had the couple that was getting together. And it's like, may I touch your arm? Yes. May I move my hand further up your arm?
That's the Antioch University.
Yes. It was like, that's freaking insane. So that way, where consent would be an action, would be if you put she puts their arm on yours, and you put your arm back on theirs. That would be an action saying that you're okay, we can go a little farther. That would be more of an action of consent versus pushing somebody away.
But starting to touch their genitalia without permission, and they let it happen. I mean, that's kind of a swinger protocol. You touch their genitalia, then next you're inserting fingers without any verbal, and they're not saying no. I mean, it's confusing.
I used to say it's okay. You touch someone, you say it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, you need to start taking some personal responsibility and being able to say no. And you have, I'm not trying to do the victim shaming there, that the victim allowed it to happen. But if they're just meeting somebody for the first time in like the swinger context. I remember the first time I ever was in, I did the swinger conference for NCSF. And I'm not from that particular world. And so I sat down on the couch, and this guy comes over, and he starts stroking my leg. I'm like, oh, you no longer have a use for those digits? You have to put yourself forward, too. But, yes, having to say yes, that's where you have to have discussions with stuff forward.
And as the affirmative consent that started at the college campus level is now moving into the legal arena, as we see the American Law Institute is doing, this becomes very complicated. It becomes very complicated.
Let me give you an example of this. It's one that's hotly debated. This is, everybody in the room is going to have the same reaction to this, which is, this is the kind of issue lawyers hotly debate. But anyway, it's hotly debated. The ALI is working with the principle that when you have a contact with the person, physical contact, of a type that you have reason to believe that that person would not only not welcome, but would find offensive, that you have committed some degree of non-consensual sexual contact, maybe a low degree, but some degree of non-consensual sexual contact. So here's the hypothetical. If there are Muslims in the room, I apologize. I don't mean this in any way at all harshly, but let's suppose you're standing in line on the bus. There's a woman in front of you who's obviously a Muslim wearing a shador, a Muslim garb and everything, and you are aware that Muslim women it's wrong to touch a Muslim woman. And you tap her on the shoulder and say, is this the bus to Spokane? And the next day the cops are at your door charging you with non-consensual sexual contact. The moral I draw from this is that there has to be some sort of judgment, some sort of taking into account the severity and the sexuality of the contact. But then again, I'm not a Muslim woman wearing a shador, so that's the target. So there are layers of complexity to all of this that even if we get the general rules better set up, we're still going to have lots of work to do with the fine points.
Let's, since we only have a few minutes left, let's talk a little bit about what the focal points for activism are. And we talked a little bit about the American Law Institute project, so we won't talk about that. Briefs in criminal cases are also something that NCSF does, which is very important. We talked a little bit about the legislative process, and lobbying and paying attention to the legislative process is very, very, very important. Educating police and prosecutors and developing public
We have something NCSF does. We go around to police in localities. We go to prosecutors, not in the context of a particular prosecution, but in the context of educating them about BDSM.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about thoughts on activism for these types of issues. We already talked about judges being elected.
One thing our program really also tries to focus on is language, how sexual assault rape is talked about. So for example, in media, if a story of a sexual assault is being reported and they're saying the 12-year-old gave the perpetrator a blowjob, just even the use of blowjob or giving, there's this idea of implied consent. Even though you know this is statutory rape, consent is not a defense here. How sexual assault is still talked about in this sort of implied consensual way, that is something we really try to educate judges, prosecutors, law enforcement, and how they talk about sexual assault. Not to, there's this tendency to think that if I keep calling it sex until the rape is proven, that shows how objective law enforcement and the legal process is. So that is something that we really try to push on. Another example is how prosecutors, for example, they write decline memos, which is basically when the prosecutor gets the case and they decide, whether or not they're going to file charges. Charges are filed, case moves forward. If charges are declined, a lot of times prosecutors will write a short memo on the reasons for declining it. Ends up being really victim-linked. This is all the things that were done wrong by the victim. This is why we're not going to charge this case. And it's not a balancing of facts. So there's a lot of advocacy around language and how it's used. And I'd really encourage everybody to hold your media accountable. Write into your reporters. Challenge how they talk about these cases and how much victim blaming happens.
You should also urge all of you, whatever jurisdiction you're in, that it's important to be alert to what legislation is going on. Not that's directly, this is anti-BDSM or there are victims' rights in rape or something good jumps out at you. But there's stuff that affects significantly our communities and we have to be alert to. I'll give you an example. Many states have been enacting anti-strangulation laws. The rationale for this comes from the domestic violence community. Perfectly legitimate rationale, because there are all sorts of statistics to show that when domestic disputes reach the point of one person strangling, putting their hands around the neck of the other, that is getting very close to the point where there will be serious, injurious domestic violence or even murder. But these laws could be pretty bad for our community, for the BDSM community. And we worked with a law that was being done down in California, which would have made it a crime to use what do you call it?
A gas mask or a
hood or something like that. And so it's important to be alert for those. NCSF can come in and help, but it's hard for us to be alert to every state and every legislature. And so that's really important to keep on top of these things.
Anything else?
I saw a question over here.
Oh, I was commenting on what he was talking about. Yes, only means yes, and no means no. And this is outside of a legal context, but I feel like just like we tell people not to play outside of their skill level as top or bottom in terms of if you don't know how to defend somebody well, don't say you can't do it. I think we should be playing within our social skill level as well. And so for some people, they might need to ask every single time, may I touch your arm? Can I give you a hug? Can I do this? And I think being very clear about where your social skills fall in.
I also think as in advocacy, when we ask each other, what can we do? Some people are turned off by participating in their politics, and I think we need to look upon our own career fields and take the conversation to our career fields, because the definition of consent goes beyond sexual acts. I work in healthcare, and the very first thing I did when I took my new job at Madigan was to go into my files of my profession and look to see what patient advocacy and education files were in there. There was nothing about sex. There was nothing about consent. And the first time another medical provider watched me provide independent health care, I asked for consent every time I touched my client. And they went, that's a waste of time. And I said, no, it's not a waste of time. I need to know that this person, who's obviously in the hospital and altered, is consenting to me touching their abdomen or touching them in a way that they're not expecting. And that consent needs to happen, the talk about consent needs to happen in healthcare. It needs to happen in schools. It needs to happen in our professions. And that grassroots effort makes the conversation easier to have because it's outside of a intimate realm. And we're talking about consenting, in their everyday lives today.
Thank you for that, because it's important to talk about the concept of consent just in general. I think we're out of time, so I want to thank everyone. We are all around for the day, and would welcome any individual questions you have. Thank you so much.